Well, we're kind of already getting going with what we wanted to do, which was to find out a little bit about our audience here today. Um, our talk, as you see, is why your stakeholders hate or love you, and the role of stakeholder empathy in maximizing research impact. So I'm Jennifer, and this is Matt. And on the next slide, we are going to talk a little bit more about ourselves and also find a little bit out, hopefully, a little bit more about you all. So, my background is UX research. Both of us are UX researchers, and I actually got started in this field at Blink. So, I learned a lot from people like John Dirks and other folks at Blink. And then at some point, went to work for Microsoft, and I worked for Microsoft for about 8, 9 years. And so I went from being a consultant on the outside to being, internal on the client side. And so I had both of those experiences. But I think today we're mostly speaking from that internal product team side of things. So that's a little bit about me. And Matt, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I have a background in cognitive psychology, and I kind of got into the field working with Jennifer. So Jennifer was my first manager when I started working at Microsoft about 3 years ago. Since spent about 2.5 years working with her, learned a ton, and happy to share some of the things that some of the experiences that kind of shaped this talk today, and get kind of some feedback from you all. So glad to be
Yes.
here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, and so, this talk is about empathy. This talk is about understanding your stakeholders, understanding your audience, and we're going to get into that in detail. But part of doing that is understanding you. You are our audience. You are our stakeholders here today. So I'm hoping that people can share in the chat what your roles are in terms of, are you a UX researcher? Are you a designer? Are you a PM or another role? Just to give us a sense of where you're coming from. And then if you could also make a note about, like, is there something that you're hoping to get out of this talk, or anything that brought you to it or interests you on this topic. So Rachel's a UX researcher. Great. Nina's also a researcher. Jojo's a UI designer. We've got a strategist, Carrie. John's a research manager. We've got a designer, Erin. Marina's a UX specialist, research and design. Emily's a designer. Okay, great.
Cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is there anything that anybody wants to share about what brought you to this talk, or anything you're hoping to get out of it that we can kind of make sure we cover? Again, just trying to really understand and empathize with you all as our stakeholders. And it's fine if you don't have any questions up front. We can just keep going, and feel free to ask questions as we go. Oh, stakeholder tips and tricks. Okay, we'll definitely get into that. Better understanding on how to engage. Yep, yep. Those who are unfamiliar with UX research. Okay, that's a great question. Yep. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're going to cover some of those things and more. So with that, Matt, do you want to advance the
Yeah,
slide
let's
and
do
take
it.
it from here?
Yeah, happy to. So I kind of wanted to start off by talking about my experience, and then I'll let Jennifer kind of talk about her experience too, of how we kind of came to this kind of idea and what led to this talk. So when I first came into the field of UX research, I quickly learned a lot about human-centered design and the design thinking approaches to really help understand our users. And let me know if you're not seeing. I saw
Yeah,
my.
it just went black, Matt.
All right. Not
There it
sure why
is.
it's doing that,
Back.
but I see it back. But please let me know if that happens again. But I can see it on my end too. Yes, it went away again.
Shoot.
Hopefully it stops doing that, but I'll just carry on for now. But really, working with these frameworks are one of the things that we use to understand and empathize with our users. Going through, we would often go out and apply these processes to understand our users, gather some interesting user insights, and we'd often come back really excited about sharing some of these insights with our teams. But one thing that we always focused on Jennifer and I's team, and I see it keep flashing, Jennifer. I don't know if you want to
It is. Should I try
come
sharing?
in, but yeah, if you want.
Okay. And then I probably want to go to.
I can stop sharing too and see if this.
Okay, are people seeing the right screen now? Matt, are you seeing
I'm
the?
seeing it on my end, yeah.
Okay. All right. So go ahead, Matt.
Cool. So carrying on with that, it's just that we tend to use these a lot in trying to understand our users, taking some of this information back to our team. And one of the things that we really tried to focus on the team that Jennifer and I were working on was really that being only half the battle. Of like, one of the things that's really important was to not only get that user feedback, but if we didn't successfully communicate that to our product team partners or stakeholders, that it was less impactful to the product design. So over the next few years, I really started focusing on that activation piece, or we called it activating these research insights. So we'd go out and gather them, but now how do we activate them, get them to our stakeholders and get them to use those? So I was focusing on that and really wanted to answer the question, how can we maximize the impact we have as researchers? So I started thinking about ways to conceptualize this and realized that really one of the tools that we use for understanding our users, like design thinking and human-centered design, can really be used in a similar fashion to better understand our stakeholders and the most likely ways to get them to care about the user feedback that we have and how to act on it. So I originally called this idea stakeholder-centered approach, which is here at the bottom. And it's really just taking this idea that we could build a better experience for not only our users, but our stakeholders that address their needs, desires, and pain points so that they'll want to use our insights. And that was kind of a high level approach that I've since tried to refine over the kind of the years and some experiences that I tried to apply this and trying to iterate as oftentimes we do in the human-centered design process as well at the end, iterating it and keep building on this as we go forward. So I wanted to share one example of how one of the first times I tried to use this kind of process towards the lens of our stakeholders. And I call this, I like using this example because for one, it's interesting to me, but it also, it seems like a little bit lighthearted and fun. So I call it quote of the day. And one of the challenges I realized is I have a little calendar here, is we'd have long data collections. And at the beginning of a study, stakeholders are often really engaged and excited about the work. But as the data collection started, we tend to see a drop in engagement just over time. People get busy with their stuff. They have other responsibilities and time commitments. And so I was trying to think of ways to better try to engage our stakeholders throughout. Another thing I found that oftentimes after a long data collection, we would come to share outs and we'd be sharing a bunch of user insights and kind of get some information overload when we shared out to the teams, that it was really hard for them to kind of conceptualize and take in all that information at once. So one of my solutions was to try to mitigate some of this, was come up with this quote of the day. And this, of course, was with qualitative research. So this may not work for every approach, but in this case, I saw we're using qualitative research, and I tried to share a fun or interesting quote throughout the data. Every day we were collecting data to share with the stakeholders. And I found this was a really effective way to, one, foster engagement. So I felt that it was fun to interact with the stakeholders in that way. But another thing it really helped, I felt like, was that it's kind of built this early mental model that when we did get to the final share outs, it was much easier to conceptualize some of these findings and take in that information and act on it more appropriately. So, and I thought this was just one example I wanted to kind of share, that if we think about some of the problems or the kind of difficulties that stakeholders may encounter through staying engaged through a long data collection process, we could try to help them out by coming up with kind of creative solutions to help foster that engagement and ultimately increase our impact as researchers. So I shared this idea with Jennifer and my team, and that kind of ultimately led to the start of this project, but I wanted to kind of kick it to her to share how she received it and how some related ideas I think that she was thinking about along the same lines.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And by the way, I can't see the chat anymore, Matt. So if you could kind of monitor the chat and let me know if questions come up or anything.
Gotcha.
So, what I wanted to talk about now is kind of how I came, my process and journey for getting to this talk and these ideas, and how Matt and I sort of came together with this. And I started as an IC researcher, independent contributor researcher, and actually my first foray into user research was at Blink. I worked for John Dirks with John Dirks and learned a lot from him and the other folks at Blink at the time, back over 10 years ago when Blink was really small. And, one of the things I really learned well at Blink at the time, and really I think has been key to the success of Blink as a company, is being very conscious of not only understanding the perspective, the experience, and empathizing with the users of whatever product is being, researched and designed, but really understanding the needs and the perspective and the experience of the customer and or the stakeholder, right? So, someone at a company is hiring Blink to do a research project to understand their users better. Well, that person who's hiring us is one of our stakeholders, and having empathy for that person is really important, and making sure that we're communicating to that person in a way that's meaningful, that they can understand, that it makes sense to them, where we're kind of putting ourselves in their shoes. I remember sometimes with Karen Clark Cole, like she would look at emails that were sent to clients and she would say, put yourself in the shoes of the client to understand how they're reading this email. And I took in a lot with that experience, and brought that with me when I went into industry on the client side and worked at Microsoft, initially as an IC, later as a manager. And then I found myself in that role a lot of times, trying to coach was hiring a lot of researchers over time, as ICs and contractors, and really trying to coach them to be more stakeholder focused, because I think user researchers, bless our hearts, we have this empathy for users, right? And that's what we focus on, is doing research to understand our users and to communicate that back. And yes, that is the central and most important thing that we do. But in order to have the impact, as Matt was saying earlier, with those insights, we really have to understand the people who are going to use those insights and make those insights meaningful to them, available to them, available when they need them, understand as much as we can about them, so that those insights can be used within the product team. So I was often coaching new researchers about that, and sort of saw it from that perspective as a manager, as I was talking to our stakeholders who might be, high level leaders across the org. And they have certain needs. They want certain information about their users. And so I was always coaching my junior researchers on, how to be sensitive to that. Then another thing that came along was something that we call the research virtuous cycle. And that's what I have drawn here, as you can see. And this was something that was sort of developed by our team. We had a large research team within the Windows and Devices org of Microsoft at that time, led by Joe Munko. And so we developed this thing that we call the research virtuous cycle. So the idea is that we do research. I don't know if you can see my cursor. We do research to build knowledge, but we have to activate that knowledge. That was the term Matt was using earlier, activate it, in order for action to be taken on the product itself. And then ideally we measure what the effect of that action was, and we have a measurement of the impact of that action. And then we learn things along the way, and we integrate that back into the plan and the process for the next iteration of the product and the next set of research that we'll do. And the whole cycle is all about what's written in the center here, which is to enable data-driven decisions. So I was thinking a lot about this, and thinking about how, given that our main goal is to enable these decisions, what do we really know about how our stakeholders are making decisions, and how do we best optimize what we're doing to have that influence and enable them to make those data driven decisions. So I started working on something I call the Decisions Project with my team, and we did some research on different product teams, and how they were using insights and how they were making decisions, and trying to understand their pain points and their needs and so on. And that was really eye opening, and just sort of reinforced this passion that I was developing for really understanding that context of which we're working as user researchers and the needs of the people that we're working with. And then, along the way, I've also sort of been just, I mean, this might seem obvious to people as they're here listening to this, that like everyone needs empathy, right? And so it just made it sort of my practice in my day-to-day life of really empathizing with people that I'm working with, and doing things, to help encourage them and to try to understand them better. And so really applying the skills I'd learned as a user researcher just in my day-to-day life with everyone that I'm working with. And it really made my job more fun, more rewarding, and really helped me and my team be more effective. So the way I'm thinking, we're thinking about empathy here is really, and we know this from our user research skills, is putting yourself in the other person's shoes and understanding their full experience. So with that, let me go to the next slide here. And Matt, I believe you're going to take it from here.
Yeah. So yeah, Jennifer and I kind of met about this. We're really excited about kind of these ideas, and we're trying to find a way to kind of validate some of these and also get other people's thoughts about it, see if they were also as excited and agreed with some of some of these points. And so we had these two major hypotheses. Was one that we've kind of talked about through our shared examples of how we came to this, was that stakeholder empathy and understanding the needs and pain points of our partner teams is really a key attribute to being an impactful UX researcher. And the second was that we could apply this stakeholder-centered approach that I was kind of describing before to help deliver research that will increase our impact as UX researchers. So we really wanted to try to find ways to see if other people agreed with this. And we kind of looked inward at our own large pool of research leaders at Microsoft across various different product groups. And we conducted semi-structured interviews, just asking their opinions kind of broadly about what it means to them to foster impact on their teams, some effective practices to working with stakeholders, some ineffective practices. And then we kind of shared this idea as we're doing now and asked for them to kind of give their feedback on if they were thinking that similarly or adjacently, and kind of went from there. But Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to share about some of the kind of reactions that we got to this before we get into the findings.
And I'm glad you mentioned, I forgot to mention on the last slide, like Matt and I both sort of came at this from different directions. And then I remember at one point we were having a one-on-one and we were walking around the soccer field at Microsoft, and we were both sharing, oh, I've been thinking about this too. And, that we both got very passionate about wanting to put these thoughts together. And as we discussed these thoughts with other researchers and research leaders across Microsoft, we found that they were really passionate too. I think empathy is one of those things, as a user researcher, we learned that you have to continuously reinforce, with your stakeholders, who are our users, what are their needs. It's something that it's hard to maintain. It's hard to maintain being in the shoes of another person, right? And so it's something that as user researchers, part of our job is to continuously remind our stakeholders who our users are, what their needs are, especially when they're users that are so different in what they do compared to what we do, right? And so like Matt and I were working on a product in mixed reality for infantry soldiers. They're working outside and they have gloves on and they're being shot at, and it's just a really different environment than engineers sitting at their desks or designers, working at their computer. So it's the kind of thing that you just have to continuously reinforce. And likewise, it's one of those things about having, as researchers, having empathy for our stakeholders, I think is something we have to continue to reinforce with ourselves as well. And a lot of us are really passionate about it. We discovered, so that was fun.
Yeah, one thing I'll kind of add on to there too is that thinking about why I tried to up level this into using some of these kind of uh, frameworks that we had been using towards our users is because I mentioned the example of the quote of the day, but also there's not one solution. So it's not just you can always use quote of the day because that doesn't always fit the situation or the person that you're trying to work with, right? The PMs may need something different than engineers and designers and things like that. So I tried to up level into something that was more of a process that you could conduct to try to find ways to be impactful, not just a solution, which we often try to come up with when we're iterating on designs for users as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So Matt, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so kind of getting into what we'll want to do now is kind of share some of our findings from these interviews. So I talked about one, we shared the idea of stakeholder empathy and kind of how we were thinking about it and got some feedback on that we'll share what people's thoughts were. And then we'll get into kind of some effective practices and ineffective practices. So we've kind of tongue-in-cheek titled this why your stakeholders hate you, so some practices to avoid, and why your stakeholders love you, which were some effective practices that sometimes go hand in hand of like, if you're not doing this, you're doing this, but not always. So we'll talk about some of those. And then finish up with some kind of words of caution that we heard from leaders, and then talk about how this can be used even beyond just working with your stakeholders as well. So yeah, just kind of a roadmap of what we're going to get into here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, the role of stakeholder empathy is that, as we've already sort of been touching on, is that, really empathizing with your stakeholders, which means understanding them, at every level, sort of walking in their shoes as much as you can. What are their needs, their motives, their pain points, their context? This is something that's really critical to impactful research. We found as we did these interviews with research leaders at Microsoft that actually there were a couple people who were Hillary and Travis noted there, who actually had done a separate internal research project where I believe they interviewed like senior IC researchers and managers, and they came to that conclusion that being relational and team oriented are really the most important characteristics of highly impactful researchers. It really is what differentiates them. So being able to conduct and execute on research, that's kind of assumed and table stakes, but then being relational and team oriented with your product team is really how you have that impact. And for those of you who you know I don't know if working at Microsoft, but probably any company, you are rewarded, you are based on the impact you have on the business, right? The impact you have on the product, and in turn, the impact you have on your customer satisfaction. They're all tied together. So another quote from one of the people we talked to is that real impact happens in conversations, and that relationships and the researcher's ability to really understand the context. So that became very clear that, what we were walking in with in terms of our hypotheses was really reinforced by everyone we talked with.
Yeah. So next, kind of transitioning into some of the more effective practices and ineffective practices that we heard. One of the recurring themes that we heard across the interviews was really about relationship building and the invaluable nature of really connecting with your non-research partners on the team. So in some examples we heard of ineffective practices was really not getting to know those folks and presenting user feedback that was kind of a contextual or not relevant in some ways to some of the things that they were thinking about, which really led to some of this feedback feeling unvalued or not acted upon. And so we heard a lot about this, also about a sense of trust that we're all working towards the same goal and just have different perspectives on the same problem. And instead of feeling like we're coming as a more of like check the box or kind of at a different angle from the user perspective. So some of the effective practices we heard were really around making an effort to connect with your stakeholders and really, again, better understanding their needs and motivations, things that are driving their decision making, so that you can better situate some of that user feedback within the context or problem space that they're thinking about, which can really help to kind of drive some of that action from user feedback instead of it being more undervalued or underappreciated. So we had a quote here that I really liked, was that if you're a stranger, it's really hard to deliver user messages. And for URs that feel underappreciated or underrecognized, it can be tough, but it's best to put that other person first in the relationship and kind of gain that trust. And then this kind of conversation about users and their feedback becomes easier over time as you build those trusting relationships.
Cool. And so another point here along the lines of, why your stakeholders hate you, so to speak, is, user researchers who claim the user's always right. And, this is something that I love in a way to see in the, in like junior researchers that are just getting started in their career. And they come in with this great passion to really advocate for users, which is definitely our job, right? We do need to advocate for users. That is our main role. At the same time, we really do need to understand that business and technical context in which we're working. So stakeholders who, appreciate it when we really, make it clear that we understand that, user insights and feedback are one part of the equation. At the same time, we still want to inspire them to be open to possibilities. If you've worked with engineers, you know that they get very, I shouldn't stereotype, but they have their own pressures, right? And they need to be able to ship, they need to be able to deliver. And so and they don't want to have to throw away work that's already been done, right? So they're working in this context, and so they can become very defensive. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. And so one thing that we can do, I mentioned and thinking. So this is a common design thinking practice where you talk about, users need X, and then there might be some technical or business constraint that is in opposition to that. So users need X, but Y is, whatever that constraint is. And if we use the word but, then we link those things together and it becomes kind of confrontational. So it's good to keep in mind, if you can use the word and, it tends to kind of take the pressure off. So you said users need X, and are these technical constraints and these business constraints, and then enlist the creativity of your engineering and design partners with and PMs. I mean, they are, people are very creative, and then when we use that word and, that creativity can come forth, and there may be alternate ways of solving for user needs than we've thought of before. So that's just a little tip and trick in terms of one method for encouraging openness to possibilities. And there's some quotes here. We talked about that first one about executing research as table stakes, but really understanding that business context and technical context and that larger framework and system is the differentiator for having impact. And researchers who only care about the customer or user and make it their job to sort of shine the spotlight on bad behavior, and kind of tell designers and engineers, what all the problems are, without giving solutions. Eventually, they're seen as not really empowering or being part of the team. So it's important to, understand that bigger context. Again, empathize with your stakeholders and what kind of technical and business context they're working in. Next slide, Matt.
Yeah. So another thing we heard in our interviews is more around the way that we kind of package and share our findings or insights. And so one of the most common examples we heard was this idea of sharing the kitchen sink of data. And this really goes back to some empathy aspects of not knowing your audience and really not knowing their goals or the things that they really care about. And it's I found I struggled with this early on. Is that it's very exciting to go out and get user data and feedback, and you have all this and you want to share it all because it's all feels important and exciting. But really taking the time to understand, okay, what bits of this information are actually relevant to the audience that I'm sharing this to, and really helping again to try to understand what it is that's most relevant to you and packaging it in a way that's more easily digestible. And so that gets into some of the why your stakeholders love you here is just making the findings easy to digest. I like this one because also it relates to some of the quote of the day. I try to think about this in a way of like, if we share out some of these interesting quotes, then later on it's also easier to digest. I talked about that a little bit. But really, again, knowing the decisions that are upfront in their minds that are most important and speaking their language too can help not use jargony terms or research terms or get bogged down in methods to really try to uplevel how easy it is to use the research findings that we gathered. So
Yeah, can I build on that a little bit, Matt? I just wanted to mention that,
yeah,
speaking their language reminds me of the fact that you often have to tailor your what you share to your audience, in terms of, if are you sharing with like the designers who want to know exactly how to edit their wireframes, um, which are very detailed level of getting deep into the weeds, or are you sharing with the VP or high level leaders who really just kind of want that broad stroke, that general idea of how is the product doing out in the field, out in the market. So really important, yeah, to really explain, and make it clear, what does it mean for your audience as you're sharing your insights and using language they understand. Like at Microsoft, it's very much an evidence-based culture, very data oriented. And so some people use this term hypothesis, as we did in this talk, because that's something that appeals to our audiences. So another reason why you might have issues with your stakeholders is if you're spreading yourself too thin. This is something we hear a lot. Typically, user researchers are there are not enough of us to do all the work that everybody would like us to do, that we would like to do, and we can end up spreading ourselves too thin to really do the job well. And so that's something to watch out for. And so it becomes important to really clarify your priorities, explain to your stakeholders who want you to do certain kinds of research, why you maybe have time or don't have time, and make those tough decisions and know when to say no, or later, let's put it into the queue. um, Another important excuse me important point here is aligning your priorities with the priorities of the larger team and the business goals, and not only just aligning, like, but influencing what are those priorities. So at Microsoft, there's been this effort over time to make our goals, our OKRs, which stands for objectives and key results, very customer focused. So it might be something like, customer love for a product, it increases by 50%, or customer engagement with a product increases by X%. And so if we align our priorities with our stakeholders according to those OKRs, that helps us work with them in a more effective way. And if the overall priorities of the organization are not aligned with user needs, then that's part of our job too, is to try to influence what those objectives are and align them with customer needs, user needs. And one of the quotes here I wrote was I pulled in was really interesting, I thought, from one of the people we talked to, is that sometimes you can be disagreeing with a stakeholder just because there's a mismatch of incentives or assumptions. And so an engineer may be very highly incentivized to ship the product. And so research, which kind of slows that process down, could be at odds with that. And so there may be a need to kind of work upstream of the engineers, maybe working with the engineering leadership to shift, what those dynamics and priorities really are for the engineers working on the ground.
Oh yeah. So this one, we also heard a lot about in trying to engage non-researchers in the process of researchers, kind of bringing them along the journey, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. Was one of the challenges that we heard, or ineffective practices, was really creating this process-heavy research, or really making it difficult to kind of engage with the research team and understand what our goals were. And so some effective practices to kind of get around this was really clearly defining what you're asking them. So when you're asking for feedback on a research protocol, really clearly defining what sort of feedback you want, not just giving it to them and say, hey, can you read this? Let me know what you think. Uh, Understanding again what they want out of research and what they want to engage with so that you can better kind of tailor that experience towards what their skill sets might be, or their other constraints like time, their own skill set, and then really just understanding how they want to be involved can really help to get the feedback from them and get them engaged more in research as opposed to making it more difficult. So we have a quote here, just how people will really go passive aggressive to kill some of this process heavy work that one of the leaders talked about at Microsoft. So
Thanks, Matt.
yeah.
So I'm kind of conscious that we have like 8 minutes left, and I want to. These are our pragmatic tips, and I remember someone was asking in the chat thread about tips and tricks. So we're going to get into that. So one thing we're recommending is really meeting with your stakeholders early and often. We talk about doing your research early and user research early and often. Well, kind of the same thing goes with stakeholders. Do your stakeholder research early and often. Don't wait until they have a specific research need to meet them, have a conversation. Continuously build rapport, trust, and understanding. Use those research skills that you have honed as user researchers and apply them with your stakeholders. Build those relationships, develop that rapport, treat them as partners, as fellow humans with insecurities. I think a lot of time junior researchers end up talking to very high level leaders, and it feels the power dynamic is really different. And so I think it's good to remind ourselves that even people at high level in the organization, they have insecurities as well, and really treating, empathizing with that, getting to know who your decision makers are and their roles so you can speak to your audience. What do they need to know? And then what do they already know? This is something that I feel like is a common mistake with junior researchers, is to kind of stumble into a share out of research and share things that the team already knows, or a big part of the presentation might be things the team already knows, and so it doesn't come across really well. It doesn't have a lot of impact. So again, this is something to kind of make sure you understand early on in the process. And then another thing is like bringing different data sources together in a multidisciplinary forum and making sense of it together. This is something that has become more and more common at Microsoft that has been very effective. And there was a quote here about, hanging out in the home turf of your stakeholders. Go to their all hands meetings, be curious about what messages they are hearing from their leaders, build a shared landscape to clarify the problem space and assumptions. This picture is supposed to be hanging out on the home turf. Next slide. So another pragmatic tip. So this one's a little bit challenging, I think. It's if we can help our stakeholders succeed, like getting them promoted, helping them achieve their goals, encouraging them, taking their best interests as part of our own, we get them, we build advocacy. And this, again, I'm talking about the internal perspective, like at Microsoft or another corporation. And there have been many stories I've heard of user researchers and user research teams that have engaged with PMs or stakeholders and really helped them succeed, so that that person ends up becoming a leader within the org and is a huge advocate for user research, and then helps bring along the user research team. So this is kind of an indirect and kind of long term investment, but really helping your stakeholders succeed is a great way to have impact and have influence. Again, for like in this quote here on the right, for you user researchers who kind of feel unappreciated and unrecognized, this can be a little bit tough, but I think it pays dividends in the end to really, build up the other people, allow them to own the insights, and they'll remember, where they came from.
Yeah, so another tip that we heard from leaders was really in a lot of different ways. Prioritization came up, and I know we talked about this in the kind of effective and ineffective practices, but I just want to kind of double click on this because we heard it so many times. Two different ways to kind of prioritize. One, prioritizing your own workload so that you're not spread too thin. We talked about that, and really a big component of that was communicating that prioritization so people know why I'm prioritizing this way. And hopefully that's in line with the larger goals of the team. So influencing and aligning with these goals that everyone should on the team should be shooting for. But another interesting thing we heard of as a pragmatic tip was really, especially when you are prioritizing, is to start with prioritizing who you work with by how much they want to engage with research and kind of the value that you're seeing there. So prioritizing these relationships first and then building from there almost helps you, again, gain these advocates that may help you gain larger advocates and groups down the road. So I thought it was important to kind of bring this up as a pragmatic tip because we heard this so much in two different ways, both your own workload, but also who you work with. Yeah, and for this one, we kind of talked about this again as the ineffective practices, but really bringing stakeholders along for the journey, but importantly, just the right amount. So opening the black box of research so it's clear what sort of nuance goes into research, helping them understand the process of research, at the same time making it easy to engage and kind of help them to engage where they want to engage, but also based on their skill set and what they want to get out of it. So we heard some also approaches to empathy of getting stakeholders to empathize with research as well. And so this is one way to kind of bring them along on the journey to see what the research goals are that can better help you gain influence or impact with them as well.
Yeah, and I think there was a comment early in the chat in this session about, what about stakeholders who aren't that familiar with the process or understand research. So yeah, I think it's definitely important to kind of educate them on that. So Matt, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So one of the things that we also wanted to kind of bring up here because when we shared this idea of stakeholder empathy, a word of caution that we heard from several folks was that to be mindful really of taking stakeholder empathy too far, that this can really influence the power dynamics or kind of make research feel in opposition if you're kind of, I guess, not acting as a peer, but really just doing what they are asking or trying to be subservient or people pleasing for lack of a better term. So this really helps to try to be cautious of one, being empathetic, but also standing your ground when you need to speak those difficult truths about the users and not just talking about and sharing things that stakeholders want to hear.
Yeah.
So I think this was an important point to bring up.
Yeah, one of the sort of tips and tricks we learned along the way is to talk about risks of different options. So, if it, things, they're very sensitive, like if we make this change, this is going to upend 2 years of work. Okay, well, let's talk about, okay, you could do this or you could do that. And what are the risks of the different options? So, being sensitive to the fact that it's going to have a big impact on your stakeholders, certain choices. So just some final words here. You heard us talk before about, just in this last slide about the power dynamics. And one of the things we heard is actually stakeholders as a term is something that a lot of the people we talk to don't like to use anymore. They want to use the word partners because they don't want to set up that power dynamic where the user researcher is sort of beholden to the stakeholder, but rather we're partners in the product team. And then another thing to think about is that our stakeholders or our partners are human beings, and that humans desire and function better with empathy for each other. And user researchers, we are really good at empathy, right? We're really good at empathy for our users. So, in order to be really impactful as user researchers, we can apply that honed skills we have of empathy to our stakeholders, our partners, our colleagues, really everyone we work with, everyone in our lives, in fact. And I have found that it's served me so well, just in all my relationships to kind of apply those skills of empathy, of really walking in other people's shoes. And maybe this sounds just kind of obvious to some folks, but I feel like it's one of those things that just bears reinforcing, because it's so easy as humans to kind of forget what it's like to be in another person's shoes. So with that, we have a thank you slide. We wanted to thank Joe Munko, who was my manager for a number of years at Microsoft, for the title and early feedback on this project. Andrew Lambert, who was a colleague who worked a lot on the interviews and the analysis, but couldn't be here as part of the presentation. Our research community for their engagement, passion, and empathy. Our product team stakeholders for the great partnerships that we've had and what we've learned from them. And then Convey UX team and Blink for putting on this conference. So thank you very much. And thanks to all of you in the audience. I don't know how many of you are out there. I can't see the chat right now, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Do you have any final words, Matt?
No, this has been great. I'm happy to share it. I'd love to hear any kind of thoughts too. I don't know if we had time for Q&A built into this and we went over it, or if this leads to the Q&A.
Yeah, so a 15-minute break did just start, but if there's one or two questions in the chat, I mean, definitely feel free to answer those, but yeah.
Cool. A lot of things I see.
Yeah, appreciate y'all. Thanks for coming. This has been fun. It's been fun to work with you, Matt. So thank you.
Same.
And thank you, Abby.
Of course. Great. So I don't see any questions so far. So I think we're all good to end the session. But we do have a wrap up that starts in 15 minutes. So on the stage. So feel free to note that, but thank you all both so much.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.